If you watch him on YouTube, he's a highly articulate man, obviously. And there's just something mesmerizing about Foucault.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director. Today we wrap up our four-part series of discussions looking at four massively influential figures who together help explain our present moment, how we arrived at where we are today. Today's final figure is Michel Foucault, perhaps the least known of the four, but he might be the one with the greatest direct impact on the way that many in our culture think today. Before we get to Foucault, though, I welcome Bishop Barron, filming now from his new diocese in Minnesota. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Thanks, Brandon. Always good to see you. It's still very warm here in Minnesota as I arrive. It's the summertime, and it's Midwestern. It's heat and humidity, so I've not been used to that out in California.
Well, we got a few new books that have just been released by Word on Fire.
Yeah.
I always love to mention them here on the show. I'll mention two of them now. We'll talk about the third one at the end of the episode. The two I want to mention go together because they're both about Thomas Aquinas. I'm holding them up here. The first one is Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master. This is a book by you. You wrote this a while ago, but then it's been updated, a lot of new things added, including footnotes and an index. What is this book about? Tell us about it.
That book is a somewhat more popular version of the first half of my doctoral paper. So when I wrote that many years ago in very high academic sort of jargon, I wanted to make it more accessible. And the argument of my dissertation in many ways was that Aquinas is not to be read simply as an abstract philosopher, but he's someone who's deeply in love with the Lord, and his Christology is perhaps the most important element, but often overlooked. And so what I do in that book is I take the great doctrines or teachings of Aquinas and show how they're meant to draw someone finally into a Christ-like stance. They have a spiritual and moral implication. Now, in my doctoral paper, I lay that out in great detail and with more technical language. I do it more accessibly in this book. So it was the first book I wrote when I got back from my doctoral studies. It would have been like, I was writing it probably 1993, 94, something like that.
So again, beautiful new edition, hardcover, great book.
Yeah, it looks nice.
This one, along with the second one, are both part of our new Word on Fire academic imprint. We're trying to publish more serious, higher level books on theology and the spiritual life. This second one is titled Thomas Aquinas, Selected Commentaries on the New Testament. And it's edited by our own Jason Payon, who is the editor of Word on Fire Academic. It's a big, thick book. I think it runs 400 plus pages. It's a selective anthology of Thomas Aquinas' New Testament commentaries. So Aquinas wasn't just a philosopher, he was a biblical theologian and wrote a lot about the Bible. It's organized to reflect especially the centrality of Christ in his commentaries. So that was kind of our organizing principle. So the cool thing is that right now, if you buy Bishop Barron's book, Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master, you get the second book for free. So we normally are going to sell this for $30 eventually, but you get it for free when you order Bishop Barron's book. So I'll include a link to both of those books in the show notes, but you can find out more at wordonfire.org. Okay, let us turn now to the fourth and final discussion in our series on understanding the present moment. Again, this series was born of a talk you gave a couple years ago titled Ideas Have Consequences, the Philosophers Who Shaped Our Time. That talk was hugely popular. I think it's got almost 1 million views now, and so we wanted to do it.
To my great surprise, I must say.
I agree.
I never expected that talk to be popular.
Again, I always think, we've mentioned this in the past, how early on you were advised by media consultants, keep it short, keep it punchy, lower level. People don't want long, in-depth talks, and here you are talking high-level philosophy for an hour to 1 million people.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to Foucault. We've talked about Marx, we've talked about Nietzsche, we've talked about Sartre. Michel Foucault. Before we get to his main ideas, who was this guy? What should we know about Michel Foucault?
Yeah, my memory, Brandon, when I was a student in Paris, I arrived there in 1989, and Foucault died in 1984, so just 5 years before. And, Paris is famous for restaurants and bookstores. You go around Paris, every block has got a little restaurant with great food and a bookstore. They love to feed the body and feed the mind. Well, my memory is that practically every bookstore had a photograph of Michel Foucault kind of looking out at you, you know. He's a very distinctive looking guy. He had a bald head and kind of owlish glasses. And he was like the embodiment of the French public intellectual. Because the French, you know, to their credit, they treat their intellectuals a bit like rock stars. They're the way we might treat sports figures. And, you know, Foucault wrote at a super high abstract level, yet some of his books became bestsellers. Anyway, that's my memory of Foucault when I first arrived in Paris. He's born in 1926, I think it was. So, you know, he'd be like my mother's generation. Died pretty young. He was only 58 when he died. He went through that great Parisian academic system I talked about last time in regard to Sartre. Like Sartre, went to the École Normale Supérieure, which is like the crème de la crème of French academic life. It was a few blocks away from where I lived in Paris. I used to go by it all the time, and it's on the Rue d'Ulm, the Ulm Street is where you find the École Normale. And Foucault went there, and then like Sartre too, he commences a career as a teacher. He spent a little time in Uppsala, up in Sweden. He was there on the philosophical faculty. He then begins to write in the 60s and 70s these extraordinary texts that were on issues such as the prison system, and one is called Surveillance and Punishment. He has a book on folie, the madness. What constitutes madness? How is that determined by society? Then one of his last studies, L'histoire de la sexualité, the history of sexuality. What are the changing views about the morality of sex? And these books, you know, had quite an impact, I'd say, on French cultural life. He dies, as I say, relatively young in 1984. But I've said, Brandon, I think of all the people we looked at, the most influential on the postmodern woke mentality is Michel Foucault. And I think in many ways, he sums up the three figures we looked at Marx and Nietzsche and Sartre, and kind of gives them an expression that then makes its way into American intellectual life. So Foucault had a big impact on the American universities. And, you know, at first it probably stayed in faculty lounges, or it stayed in high-level classrooms. But in time, it's trickled down into the wider culture. And I do think if you like wokeism, then Michel Foucault's your guy. If you don't like it, he's the one that you should be blaming, I think. So whatever you say about him, massively impactful figure.
Foucault is notoriously complicated. I think beginners to his writing quickly get overwhelmed and find it obscure and difficult. But I want to talk about some of his major ideas and some of his methods. One of his methods was to traffic in what he might call the archaeology of ideas. What does this mean?
Yeah, think of an archaeological dig where, you know, you're looking at what's on the surface, but then you're digging down to the various levels of a city. And let's say, or like you remember in Rome at San Clemente, that great church, and then they dug down underneath and they found all kinds of earlier churches, and even going back to pre-Christian times and so on. So that's the image I think he has in mind, that you're looking at something on the surface today. So there's something, some institution, there's a way of thinking, a way of behaving. And say, oh yeah, there it is. You know, that makes sense. But now dig down underneath it. Look at earlier forms of it. Go way back, go back centuries now. And how did people inhabit that space intellectually? So to take his famous examples, punishment, the prison systems. Who gets punished and why? What's considered criminal behavior and why? And we say, oh, you know, this, and that, and for these reasons. Okay, but now dig down. Do your archaeology. And what will you find? Well, in other ages, those things weren't considered crimes. Those things weren't punished. Or other things that we now say, oh, that's perfectly fine. Those were severely punished. Maybe the best example would be heresy. Go back to, you know, our hero, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, one of the greatest intellectuals in the West, took it for granted that a heretic should be publicly killed. You know, and Aquinas is no, you know, barbaric figure. On the contrary, he was the leading intellectual of his time. Thomas More, you know, one of my heroes too, would have taken for granted that a heretic should be burned at the stake in a public place. Foucault was very interested in that. Why today we would say, no, that's horrific. Even if we were to say, yeah, that guy's a heretic, I'm not going to recommend I burn him at the stake in a public place, right? So he's interested in what happened, what shifted around. What does that reveal? Now, do other examples. Madness. What's considered madness in one era, and that guy needs to be put away, and then today, what's considered madness, where that person needs to be put away, and they might be very different depending on the society and so on. Or then most famously, maybe the last study he did on sexuality. So we say, oh, there's the way people should behave sexually, and sure, that makes sense, and that's the right way. But yet, go way back, as he did, like to the pre-Christian times, to the classical world, you find entirely different sexual mores. Who are the people that gave us the natural law? So we'd say, yeah, natural law philosophy that we follow in terms of sexual ethics. Well, the ancient Greeks did. But yet, it seems pretty clear that ancient Greeks thought it was okay for an older man to have sex with a younger man. It was sort of just part of the way things happen. They did think there were bad expressions of sexuality, but they were for very different reasons than we would offer today. Okay, so that's the kind of thing Foucault's very interested in, is when you dig down. And then what does he find? And this is where Nietzsche comes in very strongly. He's, I think, hugely impacted by Nietzsche. Power, plays of power. Who's in charge of the society? And how are they structuring society in such a way as to maintain themselves in power? That becomes a major preoccupation of Michel Foucault. And then here's an interesting distinction, Brandon. If I get his language right, there's like coercive power, which is very obvious. So I'm going to threaten you. I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to threaten you with prison, or threaten you with death. That's coercive power. But he's more interested in what he calls, I think it's normalizing power. Meaning all those ways that subtly within a society, we structure things in such a way that they're going to behave a certain way. We just make it so that, yeah, they want to behave that way. When in point of fact, it's powerful people within that society have so structured the operation that they get people to do what they want and to think the way they want them to think. So Foucault wants to do the archaeology and then find who are the people that were kind of running the society, and what did they want, and how are they controlling people through forms of discourse, through ideology, through certain cultural practices. Now, I hope as I'm just doing a very quick sort of overview of it, but I think you probably can hear a lot of the rhetoric of the woke thing today, right? So, hey, well, here's the way you should behave. Yeah, but wait a minute, you're a white man who's part of a power structure that's patriarchal, and why should I be listening to you? And you've set this thing up so that your people are going to have an easier go than my people, right? So that's how Foucault's thinking, I think, has come into the operation today. But he did, to his credit, he was not a superficial guy and did very serious kind of research into the different layers, hoping to uncover the plays of power that were operative at given moments.
Maybe the central theme of Foucault's philosophy, you've hinted at it just a couple moments ago, is the relationship between knowledge and power, or to use his jargon, modes of discourse. What's he getting at here?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. Because modes of discourse, which means the way we talk about things, the way we argue, the way we present our ideologies, can seem very innocent. I'm just here thinking the thing through and coming to my conclusions. Foucault is like the great masters of suspicion. Ricoeur used that language to describe Marx and Freud. Yeah, I know that's what's going on the surface, but what's really going on is something else. So I know that discourse you're using and that argument you're making just seems, very rational and commonsensical and obvious. But in fact, it's serving this often hidden power structure. Think here of Marx, right? Substructure, superstructure. I think that's where Marx influences Foucault. So Marx would say, yeah, on the surface, there's religion and there's the army and there's politics and there's the arts and they seem innocent enough. And they would all justify themselves in obvious ways. But then Marx says, yeah, but deep down, what's really going on is some kind of economic exploitation, right? And these things are just protecting the economic powers. Or Sigmund Freud. There's someone behaving, yeah, that makes sense on the surface. That, yeah, I understand what he's doing. No. What's really going on is this guy's acting out some repressed sexuality. So they tend to play the Marxist superstructure, substructure game. And I think Foucault comes into that picture too. Yeah, there's the way we organize our lives sexually, we organize our prison system. Here's how we organize the process by which we institutionalize people, etc. And that all seems, rational and innocent. No. Look down deep, do a little archaeology there, and you're going to find there's some power structure in place. It's funny, Brandon. When I know you're very active in the Chesterton School and founding a Chesterton School. And I think it was the other day you sent me this beautiful picture of the books, that you're recommending, right, for the kids. And they're all these wonderful, the great books, right? And look, you and I, we love the great books. I was raised on them. And the great books go back to someone like Mortimer Adler, early part of the 20th century, who determined these are the great books. Well, if you're Freud or Marx or Michel Foucault, what do you begin to say? You say, okay, why did Mortimer Adler choose those books? And Mortimer Adler, who's a white guy, he's a Jew who had become a Marxist and then became an ardent Christian. So what's going on there? What's his agenda? What is he trying to pull here? Why would he think these are the great books and therefore the other ones aren't so great? You know what I'm saying? And you can hear this is the way the woke mentality goes, but it's coming out, I think, of this Foucaultian suspicion of, so let's say in your case, well, Brandon Vogt is so suggesting Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, and well, okay, but who is this Brandon Vogt fella, and what does he want? And well, he's a white guy, isn't he? And he's got this certain economic background, and he's coming out of a deeply Catholic perspective, and how come all the people he's recommending are white, and how come they're all Europeans, and so that manner of thinking, I think, is very conditioned by these people we've been looking at, and especially Foucault.
I can't resist at this point asking you to briefly share your encounter with Mortimer Adler, now that you brought his name up, which is always, for me, been one of the funniest Bishop Barron stories.
It's a weird story. I was a kid, and I was writing my master's thesis at Catholic U, and I was writing on Karl Marx, and not because I was some ardent Marxist. I wasn't. I was trained in the classical tradition, but I wanted to learn a contemporary or a more modern thinker. So there was a professor I liked who knew that stuff. So I was writing on Marx. So I was there, it must have been a summer break or something. I was home in Chicago. And I had bought this commentary book on Marx. And in the store that day was Mortimer Adler. And I knew, Mortimer Adler, great. And he was signing, so he had just written, remember he wrote a lot of popular books toward the end of his career. He was signing one of those. And just stupidly, naively, I get in line and I went up to him, and I'm a kid, I didn't have any money to buy his book. And I said, I wonder, would you be willing to autograph this book? And it was a book on Marxism, And he looked at me like, what, is this a joke? And he said, should I sign it Karl Marx or Mortimer Adler? And I said, Mortimer Adler, please. So yeah, that's the one time I met him. I'm sure he was rather unimpressed by me.
Okay, let's get back to Foucault. I want to ask about the connection between Foucault and one of the other four influential figures we've been discussing, namely Friedrich Nietzsche. Both of them focus a lot on power. We just talked about Foucault's relationship between knowledge and power, but we got Nietzsche's will to power. How do these two conceptions coincide?
Yeah, I think Foucault represents a kind of refinement of Nietzsche there. I think he's very Nietzschean in stressing power. If you bracketed objective value, if you say, look, there really isn't some pure objective truth in regard to sex or to punishment or who's crazy and who isn't. So his archaeology revealed to him, well, there's nothing objectively the case. It's just shifting cultural forms, right, and different plays of power. So therefore, the really interesting question is, who's got power and how are they exercising it and why? Who's in, who's out? Where I think Nietzsche, you've got a kind of valorization of the will to power. I think in Foucault, he's suspicious of power plays. He's not saying like, hey, great, off you go, just will to power, buddy. I think he's saying, wait a minute, who in this situation is pulling the levers and why? And he's kind of, I used that image before of the Wizard of Oz, pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz. I know these things look very impressive, but they're actually just this bozo behind the curtain pulling levers. And I think his philosophy, it's like Marx that way. He's trying to pull the curtain back on the somewhat questionable forces that are in fact operating our society. So I'd say it's a kind of refinement of Nietzsche that way.
You've pointed out how a lot of today's policing of language, of the way we talk, can be traced back to Foucault. So think of things like microaggressions, trigger warnings, disguised sexism, hidden racism, homophobia, transphobia. How much of this stems from Foucault's understanding of language?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, Brandon, to ask how he'd respond to that if he were alive. I don't know, but I think there's a lot of inspiration from Foucault behind those moves because they're born of suspicion. Why am I aggressed? Well, because I know you're making this argument that just seems very objective and rational, but in fact, what's going on is you're harming me, you're excluding me, you're putting me down. And go back to that example that I used of the great books. Well, the natural reaction of people say, well, what do you mean? I guess my book isn't great. I guess, and the great books all seem to be written by white European males, and so I guess that means if I'm a Latina woman of color, then I guess I don't qualify to write a great book. So that instinct to look behind the surface to what are the power plays, that's a Foucaultian move. Now, has it run amok in our society? I would say yes. To anticipate your question about what did Foucault get right, I think he got actually a lot of things right. But is it Foucault run amok today, like where there's such suspicion of everyone's claim to anything? They're like, okay, I'm sorry, Aquinas is a dead white male, but I still think he's right, about whatever. Or yes, I know Plato was a white European male, but he was right about a lot of things. I know Shakespeare, etc. So I think there is a Foucaultism run amok that we see in the wokeism today.
You've said in some ways, I think you said this at the beginning of today's conversation, that Foucault represents the summing up of all the figures we've looked at in this series, Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre. Mm-hmm. How is that so?
Yeah, well, I think Marx may be substructure, superstructure. Nietzsche is the power stuff. Sartre is the self-invention, culture and the sort of bracketing of objective moral norms, etc. I think he's got all that in him. But it was the particular focus he had that made him, I think, kind of a mesmerizing thinker for a lot of people of his generation. I think part was the way he looked, and if you watch him on YouTube, he's a highly articulate man, obviously. And there's just something mesmerizing about Foucault. And, as I suggest, Brandon, and you've asked this before, like, what do these people get right? There is a lot right there. And I think the archaeology of knowledge is not a bad thing to do. When we get a little bit too smug or a little bit too cocky or self-confident about, well, that's the way it is, and that's right, and that's wrong, and that's true, and that's false. Well, yeah, I mean, I've been the great advocate over many years of objective moral and epistemic values and all that. But can we be maybe a bit more modest about the claims we make and maybe a little more suspicious? Maybe classical people like ourselves need to be a little more suspicious of what are power plays going on and what's really behind that language. And I'll confess I find challenging Foucault's later work on sexuality. When you look back, as I say, at the very people that gave us the natural law of morality, it's clear in the Platonic dialogues, that sex between an older man and a younger man was kind of taken for granted by the leading figures in the society. Well, how do we deal with that? And I think Foucault raises some of those questions in ways that maybe make us think a little harder about these things. And again, that's not to embrace some kind of cultural relativism, but I think it's okay when we get challenged, or that issue of who's insane and who isn't. Like, why don't we burn heretics at the stake? You and I both love Thomas More and Thomas Aquinas, the brilliant men, good, saintly men, who both took that for granted. And now we'd see that as abhorrent. Even people you and I would strongly disagree with, we're not going to drag them out in a public place and burn them alive, right? So what happened? What happened? And are those worth looking at, those examples? And I think the answer is yes.
Well, you preempted my final question, which I've asked about all these people. What did they get right? What did they get wrong?
Yeah.
You just talked a lot about what we can respect and even absorb
Well,
from Foucault's thought.
yeah, and maybe I just specify, Brandon, the modern turn, beginning with Descartes. And it's easy enough for classically minded people like ourselves to say, oh, these moderns with their subjectivism and relevant, they turned away from the objective. And there's something to that, but I come back to Lonergan here, who to me summed up the right answer. The condition for the possibility of true objectivity is a properly constituted subjectivity. And his point was, we're not just these little blank slates on which the world writes, but we're these active, involved, thinking agents, who go out to meet the world, and we ask questions and we draw conclusions. And let's face it, our subjectivity can be messed up. We can be operating with weird prejudices, and we can have blind spots. We can succumb to pressure. Like, oh, if you hold to that view, you're going to lose your job. And if you hold to that, they're not going to like you anymore. So Lonergan said we got to be continually calling ourselves to a conversion at the subjective level if we are to appreciate the objective for what it really is. So take someone like Foucault. Are there these plays of power sometimes that work their way into our own psyches, into our communities, into our modes of discourse? And maybe that would prompt, in a healthy way, a sort of examination of conscience epistemically. Boy, was I really dispassionately objective today in the way I was assessing that argument? Or was I influenced by lots of things that distorted my vision? Am I part, again, without going into wokeism, but am I part of certain modes of life that are distorting my vision of reality? Am I conditioned by people around me in such a way that I don't see things as they really are? And I think, at their best, people like Foucault, raise those questions in a healthy way.
Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. We take one question every episode. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question, just visit the website askbishopbarron.com, and there you can record it on any device. Today we hear from Michael here in my home state of Florida. He's asking about something you said in your recent discussion with Lex Friedman when defining God. So here's Michael's question.
Hello, this is Michael from Florida. Dear Bishop Barron, in your conversation with Lex Friedman, you spoke clearly at the beginning about God as being rather than as a being. But later you talked about God as the love between a father and his son. Isn't that again taking God as a mere being or two or three beings rather than as capital B being?
No, thanks for that question. We need a whole course in Trinitarian theology to really parse that out. Here's a quick way to get at it, though. When we talk about Father, Son, and Spirit, we're not talking about three beings. You're not talking about three persons in the ordinary sense of the term. Like Brandon's a person, I'm a person, and you're a person. And we have these three persons talking to each other. That's not the way to think about it. When Augustine was asked, how come we call these things persons? He said, so we have something to say when people ask us what they are. And his point was, the word person is misleading because it seems to indicate three beings. What we're talking about are three subsistent relations that obtain within the sheer unity and simplicity of God. Now, as I say, we need a whole course in the Trinity to parse all that out. The Father is the fundamental knowledge right? That God has this sort of chthonic self-possession. The Son is the act by which the Father knows himself. He's the imago of the Father. The Spirit, as you suggest there, the love between the Father and the Son. But notice, just as my mind can engage in those three moves, right? Augustine calls it mens mind, notitia sui, self-knowledge, amor sui, self-love. The mind can do that without becoming three minds. There aren't three minds that are doing it. They're three, I don't know what they are. That's what Anselm would ask. He called them nescio quid. They're three, I don't know what they are. Aquinas called them subsistent relations, which is kind of metaphysical nonsense in a way, because the one thing a relation is not in classical thought is subsistent. But anyway, you get my point, that there are three moves within the unity and simplicity of God. So they're not three beings. So that's why there's no conflict between saying God is being itself, ipsum esse, and God is a community of three persons.
Well, thank you, Michael, for your question. I mentioned that we have 3 books to mention here in this episode, and we've covered 2 of them already, the 2 Thomas Aquinas books. The third one I don't have here in front of me, but it's a very exciting new book from Word on Fire titled The Holy Hour, Meditations for Eucharistic Adoration. This is a unique collection of hymns, poetry, prayers, and reflections for adoration, pulled from across the 2,000-year tradition of the Catholic Church, designed to draw readers more and more toward the mysterious silence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. It has an introduction by Fulton Sheen, where he talks about his emphasis on the Holy Hour, and then a foreword by Bishop Barron. It includes the Eucharistic hymns of Thomas Aquinas in both Latin and English, over 25 poems with Eucharistic resonances from saints like John Paul II, Edith Stein, John of the Cross, Teresa of Lisieux, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Dante, and G.K. Chesterton. It has passages from each of the last several popes on Eucharistic adoration, passages from the Catechism, and then brief theological and spiritual reflections from Bishop Barron, but also from other heroes of Word on Fire, including Flannery O'Connor, Irenaeus, von Balthasar, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Tolkien, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and many more. So it's a very unique, special collection. If you're looking for a book to guide you in the spirituality of adoration, to bring with you to the chapel, this is the one you want. Again, it's titled The Holy Hour, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. And then finally, one last bit of homework. Next time Bishop Barron and I are together, we're going to be recapping his discussion with Lex Friedman and some of the comments that were left on the video. So I want to encourage you, if you haven't listened to that discussion yet between Bishop Barron and Lex Friedman, do it now. In a couple weeks, we'll have our episode here. So you have 2 weeks to listen to it. It's a long discussion. It's about 2 hours, and it's high level. It's invigorating, but watch it, please. And then you'll be ready for our recap episode here. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.